In 1961, the world's largest steam locomotive was silenced. It was too big, too old, and left to rust as freight trains raced into the diesel age. For decades, Big Boy 4014 was nothing but a 600-ton relic, a frozen reminder of a vanished era. Then, against all odds and reason, Union Pacific gambled on an impossible resurrection, a choice so risky it threatened to erase the legend forever. What could drive a corporation to revive a giant from the grave, and what would it take to bring this beast back to life? The answer challenges everything we thought we knew about ambition, memory, and American power. The 1940s arrived with a thunder of urgency. Across the American West, the Wasatch Range stood as an unforgiving barrier, its steep grades grinding freight trains to a crawl. The nation was at war. Factories ran day and night, and the rails became arteries for tanks, ammunition, and food, every carload a lifeline for soldiers overseas. But the mountains did not care about schedules or victory. They demanded more power than any locomotive had ever delivered. Union Pacific's answer was as bold as the problem itself. In 1941, engineers at the American Locomotive Company unveiled a machine that dwarfed everything before it. Big Boy 4014 stretched 133 feet from coupler to coupler, weighed 1.2 million pounds with its tender, and could haul more than 4,000 tons over the toughest grades. Its articulated frame let it snake through mountain curves, while a firebox the size of a garage devoured coal by the ton. The engine's tractive effort topped 135,000 pounds, enough to wrench a loaded freight out of the valley and over the summit without a helper. Inside the cab, the sense of scale became personal. Veteran crew members still recall the first time they climbed aboard. The boiler loomed overhead, gauges and levers surrounded them, and the heat from the firebox pressed against their backs. One engineer, who ran big boys from Ogden to Green River, described it as riding a living beast. Every piston stroke felt through the floor, every whistle echoing across empty canyons. The team in the cab worked as one, the fireman shoveling as fast as he could, the engineer coaxing power from the throttle, the brakeman scanning the rails ahead. Mistakes were not forgiven at this scale. The mountain demanded respect, and so did the engine. The philosophy behind the Big Boy's design was simple: overbuild, then overbuild again. Union Pacific's chief mechanical officer, Otto Jabelmann, insisted on a factor of safety that bordered on obsession. Every bolt, every plate, every bearing was specified for extremes. Wartime meant no margin for breakdowns. If a train stalled, supplies stalled with it. The Big Boys were not just tools, they were a promise that nothing would stop the flow of American freight. Stories from the era carry a sense of OWE. Crews spoke of 4014 charging up Sherman Hill, steam erupting from the stack, the rails trembling under its weight. At full throttle, the ground shook for miles. Children ran to the tracks to watch a force of nature pass by. To railroaders, the Big Boy was more than a machine. It was a companion, sometimes a rival, always a test of skill and nerve. For a moment, it seemed this giant would never be surpassed. But the world was changing fast. Even as 4014 conquered the mountains, a new kind of power was gathering on the horizon, one that would soon make legends like Big Boy seem like echoes from another age. In 1961, the end came without warning. Diesel locomotives swept across the Union Pacific system, bringing a new era that did not have room for giants built of steam and steel. Big Boy 4014, once the hero of the mountain grades, was pulled from service and set aside. There was no grand farewell, no ceremony. Just a quiet withdrawal from the rails it had dominated for 20 years. A year later, 4014 was delivered to the Rail Giants Train Museum in Pomona, California. Its final run was not a victory lap, but a one-way trip to stillness. There, the engine was placed on static display, its firebox cold and its wheels locked in place. It became a relic, a silent witness to a vanished age. Decades passed. The world changed, but 4014 did not. Visitors arrived in waves, schoolchildren on field trips, veterans who remembered steam, families seeking a piece of Americana. Some brought cameras, others came with a simple sense of wonder. They walked the length of its 133-foot frame, craning necks to see the massive driving rods and the faded Union Pacific lettering. Fingers traced the rivets along the boiler, eyes studied the battered builder's plate. For many, the locomotive was more than an exhibit. It was a gravestone for an entire chapter of American ambition. The museum setting offered no illusion of life. Dust settled on the running boards, rain streaked the paint. On quiet days, the engine seemed to disappear into the background, overshadowed by the roar of nearby highways and the steady advance of time. Yet for a certain kind of visitor, the silence of 4014 was the point. It was a place to remember not just what was built, but what had been lost. Children who never saw a steam engine under power asked their parents what it sounded like. Old railroaders standing beside the pilot told stories of nights spent in the cab, of cinders in their eyes, and the endless climb over Sherman Hill. Some visitors left notes or flowers, treating the locomotive as a memorial. Others simply stood in the shadow of its wheels, trying to imagine the thunder that once shook the rails. For more than 50 years, 4014 did not move. Its story became a cautionary tale about progress, how even the greatest machines can be outpaced and left behind. The engine's presence at the museum was a reminder, no matter how powerful, all legends eventually fall silent. But beneath the layers of dust and nostalgia, a question lingered. Was this really the end? Or could something lost for so long ever come back to life? Inside Union Pacific headquarters, the idea of reviving Big Boy 4014 set off a storm of debate. Revival was a word that sounded like a promise to some, and a liability to others. Ed Dickens, head of the Heritage Operations team, had spent years pushing for a full restoration. He argued that bringing 4014 back to life would do more than honor the past. It would capture the public's imagination, revive company pride, and showcase American engineering on a scale no other railroad could match. Heritage mattered to him in a way numbers could not capture. But for every supporter, there was a skeptic. Finance executives demanded hard numbers. What would it cost to move a 600-ton artifact across half the country? How much would it take to rebuild a steam program that had not touched a big boy in 6 decades? Early estimates ran into the millions, with no guarantee of success. Cost was the question on every spreadsheet. Risk managers raised red flags about insurance, liability, and compliance with modern safety codes. The boiler alone would need to pass Federal Railroad Administration inspections designed for contemporary equipment, not a relic from 1941. Safety standards had changed, and they meant more than paperwork. If anything went wrong, if the restoration failed, or if a catastrophic accident happened on the rails, the financial and reputational fallout could be enormous. Some executives questioned whether the resources should be spent elsewhere, especially with the company facing pressure to modernize its core freight business. Risk was not hypothetical. Others worried about the opportunity cost. Every dollar spent on 4014 was a dollar not invested in new locomotives, infrastructure, or digital upgrades. Opportunity cost was a real balance sheet consideration. Dickens and his allies countered with projections of media coverage, public goodwill, and the once-in-a-lifetime chance to run the world's largest operating steam locomotive for the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad. They pointed to marketing value, the potential for national tours, and a boost to recruitment in skilled trades. But even as the Heritage team built their case, high-level meetings grew tense. Would the return justify the risk? Could the company accept the possibility of failure, both technical and financial? These questions landed in quiet conference rooms and on long conference calls. For months, the debate circled through boardrooms and executive teams, with every scenario weighed against the bottom line. In the end, the decision would rest on more than numbers. It would test Union Pacific's willingness to stake its reputation on a gamble that could either cement its legacy or leave it with a costly, unfinished dream. Decision time would come, and with it, the risk of making history or making a mistake. The agreement between Union Pacific and the Rail Giants Train Museum was not a simple handoff. It was a careful negotiation shaped by decades of stewardship and a shared sense of responsibility for one of America's rarest engineering survivors. In mid-2013, both organizations signed the formal papers. On the surface, it was a donation, no money changed hands. But behind the signatures, the stakes ran deeper than ownership. For the museum, 4014 had been a crown jewel, watched over by generations of volunteers. The board debated for months. Some members feared losing their most famous exhibit to the unknowns of a working railroad. Others saw the chance to give 4014 a new life, one that would reach far beyond the fences of the fairgrounds. The museum's president, speaking for the group, demanded preservation assurances. The restoration would respect the locomotive's original form, and any changes would be documented and, where possible, reversible. Union Pacific's heritage team promised that 4014 would not be scrapped, parted out, or lost to private hands. The locomotive would remain a public ambassador, not a corporate trophy. Legal documents spelled out the transfer. Union Pacific accepted all liability and cost, from extraction to the cross-country move, and agreed to keep the restoration process transparent. The museum secured a role as a heritage partner, with access to progress updates and the right to participate in future educational events. While the final contract itself remains confidential, both sides publicly committed to the same goal. 4014 would serve as a living artifact, not just a static display or a private showpiece. The handover ceremony was subdued but meaningful. Volunteers gathered for one last walk alongside the engine. Some left notes tucked into the cab. Others simply ran their hands along the cold steel. When the formal transfer was complete, 4014 was no longer just a relic. It was a promise, made in good faith between those who kept its memory alive and those now charged with bringing it back to life. Union Pacific's steam crew gathered before dawn, boots crunching on ballast, eyes fixed on the silent hulk that had slept for half a century. The first order of business was to coax 4014 out of its museum cradle and onto live rails for the first time since 1961. The move was anything but routine. Every foot of track had to be inspected, every bridge and switch scrutinized for the weight of a 600-ton behemoth. Ahead lay a winding route through city yards, commuter lines, and mountain passes, each one a potential weak link. The operation was led by veteran engineers, their radios buzzing with updates as they watched the locomotive inch forward. At the Los Angeles Intermodal Yard, tension spiked. A switch beneath the tender shuddered, threatening to send the rear wheels off the rails. For a moment, everything hung in the balance. The pilot crew sprang into action, halting the move within inches of disaster. Working in near silence, they realigned the switch by hand, checking every gauge and coupling before giving the all clear. Only then did 4014 creep forward, the crisis averted, but nerves frayed. The journey was slow, sometimes just walking speed. At every crossing, crowds gathered, drawn by word of mouth and the irresistible pull of history in motion. Families lined the fence lines, some waving flags, others just staring in disbelief. For many, this was more than a train move. It was a procession, a once-in-a-lifetime chance to witness a legend on the move. Camera flashes lit up the dusk, and old-timers swapped stories about the last time they saw steam thunder through the city. Yet behind the spectacle, the logistics were relentless. Crews checked clearances under bridges, measured curve radii, and ran calculations on load limits. Any miscalculation could mean a derailment or worse. The sheer size of 4014 forced the railroad to reroute traffic, reinforce track segments, and coordinate with local authorities at every stage. Each successful mile felt like a small victory, but the risk was never out of mind. The move was not just about engineering muscle, it was a real-time test of planning, teamwork, and nerve. And with every crossing passed, the stakes only grew higher, pushing the limits of what was possible on rails built for a different era. Cheyenne's steam shop had seen its share of legends, but nothing on the scale of what was coming. As Big Boy 4014 neared Wyoming, the reality set in. The old facility, built for a different era, simply was not ready for a locomotive stretching 133 feet and tipping the scales at over 1 million pounds. The floor, once sturdy enough for smaller engines, had to be torn up and rebuilt from the foundation. Concrete was poured in thick, steel-reinforced slabs, engineered to bear the concentrated weight of the Big Boy's drivers and tender. Every square foot was calculated, every rebar measured, because a single miscalculation could mean disaster when the locomotive rolled in. The shop foreman, a veteran with decades of steam experience, took charge of the transformation. He walked the length of the empty bay, blueprints in hand, and called for custom solutions. The existing overhead cranes, designed for lighter engines, would not cut it. New cranes were fabricated, massive, electrically powered, and able to lift entire sections of the locomotive with precision. Their rails were anchored deep into the shop's structure, tested and retested for safety. Specialized jigs and fixtures had to be designed from scratch. The big boy's articulated frame and immense boiler meant that off-the-shelf tools would not fit. Machinists and engineers collaborated to build bespoke stands and braces, each tailored to the locomotive's contours. Some fixtures were welded from salvaged steel, others machined to thousandths of an inch. The shop floor became a landscape of industrial innovation, where every tool and every surface was reimagined for the task ahead. Safety and environmental systems were upgraded as well. New ventilation was installed to handle the clouds of steam, oil, and welding fumes that would fill the air during restoration. Fire suppression systems were modernized, and power lines were rerouted to support heavy machinery. The transformation was both visible and hidden, layers of new infrastructure laid beneath the surface, waiting for the arrival of the giant. By the time 4014's convoy reached Cheyenne, the shop was no longer just a relic of the steam age, it had become a crucible, ready to test the limits of modern craftsmanship and old-school grit. The foundation was set. The real work was about to begin. Ed Dickens stood at the center of the Cheyenne steam shop, eyes tracing the length of 4014's battered boiler. The challenge ahead was unlike anything attempted in modern railroading. Decades of exposure had left the steel tired and unpredictable. Before a single fire could be lit, every inch had to prove it could withstand forces that would tear lesser machines apart. The first battle was with the metal itself. Crews used ultrasonic sensors and magnetic particle tests to hunt for hidden cracks, microfractures invisible to the eye but fatal under pressure. The crown sheet, the boiler's inner roof, drew special scrutiny. Here, even a hairline flaw could mean disaster. Where corrosion or fatigue threatened the vessel's integrity, sections were cut out and replaced with modern A511670 steel. These new patches had to match the strength of the original and also satisfy today's stricter safety codes. Every weld was made by certified hands, then scanned and X-rayed, ensuring no voids or inclusions remained. The shop's silence was often broken by the tap of a hammer or the whir of a grinder, as machinists checked and rechecked their work. Only after the boiler passed a hydrostatic test, pressurized with water to 125% of its operating rating, could the team move forward. Failure here would have ended the dream. Attention then turned to the heart of the beast, the steam system. Years of dormancy had left the firebox lined with scale and pitted by rust. Crews scraped away the buildup, mapping every thin spot and measuring the thickness of every plate. Where the metal fell below minimum standards, new steel was welded in using low hydrogen rods to avoid brittleness. The stay bolts, which braced the firebox against the immense pressures inside, were checked one by one. Any that failed inspection were cut out and replaced, each marked and logged for federal records. The final test, a warm water hydro, was tense. The shop filled with the sound of pumps, gauges ticking higher as inspectors watched for any sign of a leak. The boiler held. Relief spread through the crew, but no one celebrated yet. The running gear presented a different puzzle. No supplier in the world stocked replacement rods or crank pins for a big boy from the 1940s. Engineers removed each massive component, then used 3D scanning and computer modeling to create digital blueprints. Where the original alloys were obsolete, metallurgists specified modern substitutes, balancing historical fidelity with the need for durability. The driver wheels, 68 inches across and weighing thousands of pounds, were shipped to a specialist shop for reprofiling. Axle boxes and bearings, worn from decades of stillness, were machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. New spring riggings were fabricated, and the articulation joints, designed to flex under up to 14,000 pounds of force, were rebuilt to handle the stress of mainline speeds. Throughout, Every repair was documented in meticulous detail. Weld logs, inspection reports, and test results filled binders destined for federal review. Regulatory inspectors arrived unannounced, scrutinizing each step. The shop's lead engineer kept a running tally of pass and fail marks, knowing that even a single oversight could halt the project. Only when the last bearing ran cool, the last weld passed inspection, and the last form was signed, did the team allow themselves to believe that 4014 might truly run again. The result was more than a restoration. It was re-engineering, one that married the brute force of 1940s design with the precision and caution of a new century. The shop floor, once a graveyard for obsolete skills, became a forge for lost arts and new miracles. And as the work neared completion, the question shifted from whether the big boy could be rebuilt to whether it was ready for the fire that would bring it back to life. Before sunrise, the Cheyenne steam shop was silent but for the shuffle of boots and the low murmur of last-minute checks. The restoration team gathered around Big Boy 4014, tools in hand, faces marked by weeks of tension and hope. Every bolt had been torqued, every weld scanned, every gauge checked and rechecked. Now, the moment they had worked toward for years had arrived, the first attempt to breathe life into a machine that had not moved under its own power since 1961. The fireman, hands steady despite the weight of the task, opened the oil valve. Fuel hissed into the firebox and a torch met the spray. In an instant, a blue flame licked across the brick arch and heat began to build inside the steel shell. The shop filled with the sharp scent of burning oil and the faint metallic tang of old iron waking up. Steam lines rattled as pressure crept upward, every pound per square inch a small victory. The crew watched the boiler gauges, eyes darting from dial to dial, listening for the first groan of expanding metal, a sound that meant the structure was holding, that decades of stillness were finally breaking. No one spoke above a whisper. Each hiss, each creak seemed to echo the stakes. If the boiler failed now, the dream would die with it. But as the fire grew, so did the pressure, the great barrel of steel flexing and settling, seams tightening with the heat. The chief engineer ran his palm along the side of the boiler, feeling for vibrations, trusting both his instruments and his instincts. The tension in the room was physical, a shared breath held tight, waiting for a sign that the old giant could take the strain. At last, the main steam valve was cracked open. Steam surged through the pipes, filling the cylinders with a force not felt in generations. The engineer eased the throttle forward, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a slow, deliberate shudder, 4014's massive wheels began to turn. The rods, polished and rebalanced by hand, moved in perfect rhythm. The locomotive crept forward a few feet under its own power, the sound of steel on steel echoing through the shop like a heartbeat returning after a long sleep. Some in the crew wiped away tears, others just stared, stunned by the reality of what they had achieved. The shop was filled with the low rumble of steam, the hiss of pressure valves, and the quiet awe of a team that had done what many thought impossible. Outside, word spread quickly. Big Boy 4014 had moved. Not towed, not pushed, but alive, fire in its belly and motion in its bones. For the men and women who had rebuilt every inch of the locomotive, the first fire and the first movement were more than a technical milestone. They were proof that the past could be reclaimed, that something once written off as dead could return, stronger than before. The tension broke, replaced by a deep, almost reverent relief. Years of work, risk, and uncertainty had led to this, a few feet of forward motion, powered by steam, witnessed by those who had refused to give up on a legend. The next test, out on the open rails, still loomed ahead. But for now, in the soft morning light, Big Boy 4014 was alive again. The first run outside the shop was not a parade. It was a trial by fire, an engineering shakedown designed to push every system to its limits before the world could see a finished miracle. As dawn broke over the Cheyenne yard, the steam crew checked valve settings and watched the pressure gauges climb. The locomotive eased forward, then built speed, its massive rods swinging in tight arcs. Every sound, each hiss, each knock became a clue. Within minutes, the team spotted a problem. The valve timing was off, causing a rough exhaust and uneven pull. The chief mechanic signaled a stop. tools came out, covers came off. Adjustments were made on the spot, guided by decades-old manuals and the hard-earned instincts of machinists who knew what a healthy big boy should sound like. The next run brought a new challenge. Lubrication lines, freshly rebuilt, showed signs of leakage under load. Oil pooled beneath the crossheads. If left unchecked, a dry bearing could seize and bring the entire test to a halt, or worse. Crew members crawled along the frame, tightening fittings and swapping out gaskets while the boiler still simmered. No one complained about the heat or the pressure. Every minute counted, and every fix was a step closer to proving the restoration was more than cosmetic. With each pass, the adjustments grew smaller. The engine's motion smoothed, the exhaust settled into a steady rhythm, and the temperature readings held within safe margins. The team logged every anomaly and every correction, knowing that any missed detail could spell disaster on the open mainline. Only after hours of back-and-forth testing, diagnosing, and repairing did the crew agree that 4014 was ready for the next challenge. The technical hurdles were not over, but the locomotive had survived its first real test under its own power, and the confidence in the shop began to spread beyond the rails. Crowds gathered in numbers rarely seen for a piece of moving machinery. At every stop along the main line, people filled station platforms, overpasses, and open fields, with some arriving before sunrise, others driving hundreds of miles just to glimpse the revived giant. News helicopters hovered overhead, while local television anchors struggled to capture the scale of the turnout. In Cheyenne, more than 10,000 spectators pressed against barricades, waving flags and holding children on their shoulders. The sound of Big Boy's whistle rolling across the plains drew out families, retired railroaders, and teenagers who had only known steam from history books. As the locomotive rolled into town, cell phones lit up and cameras flashed, but the moment belonged to something older. For many, seeing 4014 alive was a reunion with a lost era, proof that the thunder of American industry could still shake the ground. At trackside, veterans in faded uniforms saluted, machinists pointed out the workings to wide-eyed apprentices, and small children covered their ears, startled by the sheer force of the whistle. The highlight came when 4014 met its sibling, Union Pacific 844, on the rails. The meeting drew national headlines and became an instant icon. The two engines, side by side, created a living tableau of past and present, steam and steel bridging generations. The photograph of that moment traveled across social media and news sites, cementing the event as more than a railroad milestone. It was a celebration of memory, skill, and the enduring pull of a legend reborn. For a few days, the Big Boy was not just a machine, it was the heart of a moving festival, a symbol of pride and possibility rolling through the heart of America. Today, Big Boy 4014 steams across America. Not as a relic, but as living proof that lost skills and forgotten ambition can be revived. In an age dominated by automation, this 600-ton machine draws new generations to engineering, and enrollment in U.S. trade schools rose 16% after its return. Its whistle echoes louder now. Some giants return to remind us that progress is not just about moving forward, but remembering what we are capable of. What would you bring back?